The United States has urged Russia to declare that it has no intention of invading Ukraine. Speaking at the UN Security Council, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken repeated warnings that Russia is poised to launch an attack. Russia insisted that it is withdrawing troops and accused Ukraine of failing to implement a previous peace deal. Meanwhile, there are reports of fighting in Ukraine's east, with the government and pro-Russia separatists accusing each other of carrying out shelling attacks.
In this government-held village in eastern Ukraine, a kindergarten hit by a shell.
The Ukrainian army says a shell that was fired from the other side hit just into this kindergarten, there where you can see this hole in the wall, and it fell into the place where the kids were going to have their gym class. Luckily, none of the kids was inside that room.
Children were having breakfast at the time and were planning to have lessons in that room at 9 a.m. according to their schedule. Luckily, the children were not hurt, only the employees were shell-shocked. US President Joe Biden believes a Russian invasion will take place any day now.
They have not moved any of their troops out. They've moved more troops in, number one. Number two, we have reason to believe that they are engaged in a false flag operation to have an excuse to go in. Every indication we have is they're prepared to go into Ukraine, attack Ukraine.
At a UN Security Council meeting, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken warned Russia was already manufacturing a provocation to justify an attack.
This could be a violent event that Russia will blame on Ukraine, or an outrageous accusation that Russia will level against the Ukrainian government.
Moscow has already accused Ukraine of committing genocide in the eastern Donbas region and labeled the false flag claims as hysteria.
Nobody seeks any excuses for hostile actions. We said we do not have any intention to do this.
For days, Russia has said its troops are withdrawing from areas near the border with Ukraine, but the West believes Moscow has amassed some 150,000 soldiers around its neighbor. The conflict is far from over.
Our DW correspondent Matthias Bullinger is in eastern Ukraine, in the town of Kramatorsk, near the front line in the conflict between government forces and Russia-backed separatists. I asked him if the shelling of the nursery that he pointed out in his report was a sign that tensions in the region are growing.
Yes, tensions are growing, that's what we can say for sure. There has been intense shelling for 2 days now. After we left that place where the kindergarten is, the place was shelled again, and houses were destroyed and were on fire at night. And the same is reported from other places, villages and towns along the contact line. So there's a clear escalation here. The Ukrainian side blames it all on the other side, on the separatist side, and there is a lot of conflicting information. The OSCE has not established yet all of the details for these fires, have often just refrained from clearly stating or have not been able to clearly say where it was coming from. But what is very clear is that shelling has intensified on this side of the border. Shelling on Ukrainian villages. We have less information from the other side.
Right. So there where you are in the east of Ukraine, that's a place where the fighting never really stopped. Are people there afraid of a wider Russian invasion?
People here are afraid of an escalation, of an intensifying of fighting here. As you said, it has never stopped. There has been fighting for 8 years, although at times ceasefires were in place and they were respected. At times they were violated only slightly, and now we are seeing this escalation, the prospect of a wider invasion that would include many other parts of Ukraine. That would, for example, include an incursion from the north onto Kiev, for example. That is something, of course, people in other parts of Ukraine are worried about. However, the worries here in Ukraine do not match the international warnings. The Ukrainian government has said once again that they do not see preparations on the Russian side for a full-scale invasion. and the people are just watching this carefully. They are alert, but they are not panicking.
And there's this dispute about whether Russia really has pulled some of its troops back from its border with Ukraine. What's your understanding of what's going on?
Well, it seems that this has not really happened. When they announced the withdrawal of troops, there was some activity. Troops were being moved around, but the first thing is that Russia said it would move back the troops from the western military district, that is those places that are anyway close to the Ukrainian borders, back into their barracks, but they could be deployed quickly again. Now what we are hearing from intelligence sources is that they have not really withdrawn many. They have moved them a little bit around, but not withdrawn. Some are even saying, US have even said that they might have reinforced them. All this is based on satellite imagery. There is no head count, of course, of soldiers, right. No head count accessible to anybody else but the Russian leadership of the soldiers that are really deployed there.
OK, thank you for that, Matthias. DW correspondent Matthias Bullinger in eastern Ukraine. Let's talk to Ian Lesser, who's vice president of the American public policy think tank, the German Marshall Fund. We'll talk about the problems on Ukraine's border. He joins us from Brussels. Welcome to DW. People are fond of saying that diplomacy is working as long as no one is shooting. But it's hard to see what the last few weeks of intense, high-level diplomacy has achieved.
Well, that's exactly right. Of course, the diplomacy is essential, but the dynamics change as time has gone on and as forces have been concentrated around Ukraine, as the risk of something going seriously wrong, whatever Russian intentions are, will increase. And so there are two challenges here. One is crisis management, immediate crisis management, which so far does not seem to have been successful. And the other is to see if there isn't some way to talk to Russia about some of its longer-term concerns. I mean, President Macron has tried to do that. That, too, has not yet been successful, and that's a longer-term project.
So there seems to be little trust in this process as well. When we have Russia saying that it's withdrawing troops and the US saying, and its allies saying, well, we've checked and you really haven't. Again, it's hard to see how diplomacy can work without trust.
There's very, very little trust. I mean, that's absolutely clear. What is also clear is that it's possible to see almost everything. I mean, intelligence services, even commercial satellite operators, can provide overhead imagery, which makes, in other kinds of intelligence being gathered, makes it very clear what is happening. But of course, judging intentions is much tougher. And there, we really do get to this question of trust. And trust at the moment is I don't know if it's at rock bottom, but it's certainly at a minimum on both sides.
Talking about addressing Russia's security concerns, cynically speaking, if Russia wants to keep Ukraine out of NATO, then short of NATO or Ukraine agreeing to this demand, then all Moscow really has to do is maintain the instability at the border. Is that a sustainable policy in the long term?
Well, I have to think that Russia understands very well that Ukraine is not becoming a member of NATO anytime soon, perhaps never. I mean, this is very clear. It's one thing to have a declaratory open door, which is NATO policy. And NATO allies aren't going to back away from that. But the politics of it are also very clear, that NATO simply isn't joining Ukraine isn't joining NATO anytime soon. They may be equally concerned over the long term of Ukraine just simply coming closer to the European Union, coming closer to the West, and all that would mean for society and politics inside Russia itself. And that may be the longer concern, the longer game that Russia is trying to play to prevent that. It's pretty clear that the tougher they can make the situation look in Ukraine, the harder it will be for Ukraine to be integrated into the West.
Right. And what's your view on the way that US-European cooperation in this situation has worked? Is this a well-functioning machine?
I think it's been very, very close, actually. And, there's a package of sanctions being developed on the European side, but developed in close coordination with the United States. These haven't been revealed in detail yet, but my sense is that on an hourly basis, a constant basis, the EU and the US are talking to each other about what should be in that package and about policy towards Ukraine in general. It's a huge shift from the kind of atmosphere we had in US-EU relations just a few years ago, obviously.
All right, good talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Ian Lesser, Vice President of the German Marshall Fund.
Good to be with you.
Well, the Ukraine crisis is expected to dominate the Munich Security Conference, which begins today. US Vice President Kamala Harris is one of the first foreign representatives to arrive in Germany from the annual three-day policy forum, which was launched at the height of the Cold War. For the first time since 1991, Russia will not be attending. DW will bring you a full coverage from Munich this afternoon. One of the people you'll be seeing lots of in our coverage of the security conference is our chief political editor, Michaela Kufner. Welcome, Michaela. Let's talk about Russia. No Russia delegation for the first time in 30 years. Why?
Yeah, that's a big question. Well, clearly Russia is not interested in engaging in detail on the goings-on, not just over Ukraine, but also over other crisis regions. There's a lot to talk about at this Munich Security Conference, but the current standoff, which, as we heard, not just Antony Blinken, also the US president fears could tip over into a hot war at any point now, is clearly overshadowing every conversation that is taking place on the multiple other crises that really need talking about. After all, this Munich Security Conference, which is seen most importantly as a forum where leaders can meet in these side rooms, can have private conversations out of the spotlight while us journalists are talking here in the full glare of the public, hasn't really taken place for 2 years now. So it's about time that these leaders can meet, and with great urgency to have such conversations. Russia clearly isn't interested in talking in detail.
Thank you for that. DW Chief Political Editor Michaela Kufner at the Munich Security Conference.